Hey, welcome back to English in Fluency. I'm Alex, and honestly, I'm really glad you're here today. Before we start, just take a second, get comfortable, maybe grab a cup of tea or coffee, because what we're doing in this episode is something a little different, something I think you're going to enjoy a lot. We're not going to study grammar rules today. We're not going to memorize long lists of words either. Instead, I'm going to tell you three short stories. Real, simple, emotional stories. The kind of stories that happen to real people every single day. And while you listen, your English is going to grow without you even noticing it. That's the magic of listening practice, you see. Your brain absorbs rhythm, pronunciation, and natural sentence patterns just by hearing them again and again. The same way a child learns their first language, just by listening to people around them over and over, until one day the words simply come out naturally. So here's how today is going to work, and I promise it's simple. I'll tell you a story, slowly, clearly, using B1 level English. So if you're around an intermediate level, this should feel just right for you, not too easy, not too hard, just enough to challenge you a little and help you grow. After each story, I'm going to ask you some questions, the kind of questions you might see in a real English exam. And then, right after asking, I'll give you the answer too, and I'll explain why that answer is correct, so you can check your own understanding as we go. You don't need a pen or paper, although if you want to pause and write down a few new words, that's a wonderful idea too. Just relax, listen, and let the story carry you. And listen, if this is your first time here on English in Fluency, welcome. I'm so happy to have you. This channel is all about helping you speak and understand English more naturally through real conversations, real stories, and real practice, not boring textbook exercises. If you enjoyed today's episode, do me a small favor, hit that subscribe button, and turn on the notification bell, because every single week I bring new stories, new lessons, and new ways to help your English feel less like homework and more like something you actually enjoy doing. All right, are you ready? Let's get into our first story. Our first story is called, well, I won't give it a title. I'll just start telling it. Because that's more natural anyway, isn't it? Nobody tells a story to a friend by first announcing a title. Let's just begin. Nora worked at a small coffee shop on the corner of a quiet street, the kind of street where everyone seemed to know everyone else. She had been working there for almost 2 years, and honestly, she loved her job, even on the busy mornings when the line went out the door and her feet hurt by noon. What she loved most, though, wasn't the coffee itself, it was the people. The regular customers who came in every single day, rain or shine. And one of those regulars was an elderly man named Mr. Owen. Mr. Owen was probably around 70 years old, always wearing a soft gray coat, even in the warmer months, and he always ordered the same thing, a plain black coffee, no sugar, no milk, just black, and a small slice of lemon cake if they had any left. He would sit by the window at the same little table every time, and he would stay there for almost 2 hours, sometimes reading a newspaper, sometimes just watching the people walk by outside. He rarely spoke much, but every time Nora brought his coffee, he would smile and say, "Thank you, my dear," in a warm, gentle voice that somehow made her whole morning feel a little brighter. One rainy Tuesday morning, Nora noticed something strange. It was almost 9 o'clock, the time Mr. Owen usually arrived, but he wasn't there. She glanced at the door every few minutes, expecting to see him shake the rain off his umbrella and walk in with that familiar small smile. But the door just kept opening for other customers, and Mr. Owen never appeared. She told herself not to worry. Maybe he was just late. Maybe the weather had kept him home. But by 11 o'clock, when he still hadn't come, a small, uncomfortable feeling started growing in her chest. She finished her shift at 2 in the afternoon, and instead of going straight home like she usually did, she found herself standing outside the coffee shop, thinking. She actually didn't know exactly where Mr. Owen lived, but she remembered him mentioning once, almost by accident, that he lived above the old bookshop just 2 streets away, the one with the blue door. It felt a little strange, maybe even a bit forward, to go looking for a customer's home, but something inside her just couldn't let it go. She grabbed her umbrella and walked through the rain until she found the blue door exactly where he said it would be. She knocked, softly at first, then a little louder when nobody answered. For a moment, she thought maybe she had the wrong building. Maybe she was about to embarrass herself completely. But then she heard a faint voice from inside, calling out, weak and shaky, asking for help. Her heart jumped. She pushed the door, and thankfully, it wasn't locked. Inside, she found Mr. Owen lying on the floor near the staircase, his glasses knocked to one side, his face pale, clearly in pain. He had slipped that morning while coming down the stairs, twisted his ankle badly, and hadn't been able to reach his phone, which was sitting uselessly on a table across the room. He had been lying there for hours, cold, frightened, and, honestly, quite embarrassed too, the way people sometimes feel when they need help but hate admitting it. Nora didn't waste a second. She called for an ambulance immediately, sat down right beside him on the floor, held his hand, and kept talking to him gently, telling him it was going to be fine, that help was coming, that he wasn't alone anymore. At the hospital later that evening, after the doctors had checked him and confirmed it was just a bad sprain, nothing broken, Mr. Owen looked at Nora with tears actually forming in his eyes, and he told her that his wife had passed away 3 years earlier, and that he genuinely had no one else close by, no children living nearby, no neighbors who checked on him. He said that coming to the coffee shop every morning wasn't really about the coffee at all. It was about having somewhere to go, someone to talk to, even just for a minute or two. And that small kindness, coming to check on him, had honestly saved his life that day, because the doctor mentioned that if he had stayed there much longer in the cold, things could have become far more serious. From that day forward, Nora started checking on him more often, sometimes even walking over after her shift just to say hello. And Mr. Owen, in turn, became something like family to her, the grandfather she never really had growing up. It's a simple story, really, nothing dramatic, no big explosions or twists, but it shows something important, doesn't it? Sometimes the smallest act of noticing someone, of simply paying attention when something feels different, can genuinely change, or even save, another person's life. Okay, now let's check your understanding, shall we? I'm going to ask you a few questions about the story, and don't worry, I'll answer them myself right after, so you can compare your own thoughts with mine. First question, where did Nora work? Well, if you remember, she worked at a small coffee shop on a quiet street corner, and she had been working there for almost 2 years. Good, let's continue. Second question, What did Mr. Owen usually order? This one's easy if you were paying attention. He always ordered a plain black coffee, no milk, no sugar, and sometimes a small slice of lemon cake. And he always sat at the same table by the window. Third question. Why did Nora start to worry about him? Simple, because he didn't show up at his usual time, around 9 o'clock. And as the hours passed, and he still didn't arrive, she felt something was wrong, which is exactly what happened, since he had actually fallen down the stairs. Fourth question. What had happened to Mr. Owen? He had slipped on the stairs in his home and twisted his ankle, and he had been lying on the floor for hours because his phone was too far away to reach. And finally, question 5. Why did the coffee shop actually matter so much to Mr. Owen, beyond just the coffee itself? Because after his wife passed away, he felt very lonely, and the coffee shop gave him somewhere to go every day, and someone, Nora, to talk to, even briefly. That small routine gave his days meaning, and honestly, that's a lesson worth remembering. That sometimes the little things we do without thinking, saying good morning, asking how someone's day is going, can mean the entire world to another person. All right, take a breath. Let that story settle in your mind for a second. Maybe repeat a sentence or two out loud if you'd like. That always helps with pronunciation. And now, let's move to our second story, a slightly different kind of story. This one about distance, friendship, and time. Leo and Ivy had been best friends since they were 6 years old. They grew up on the very same street, went to the same school, sat next to each other in almost every class. And honestly, people in their small town used to joke that you never saw one of them without the other close behind. They built a small wooden tree house together in Ivy's backyard when they were about 10, and they used to spend entire summer afternoons up there talking about absolutely nothing and everything at the same time, the way children do. But then, when they were 16, Leo's father got a new job, a really good opportunity. But it meant the entire family had to move to another country, far away, across the ocean. Leo remembered the day he told Ivy, sitting on the steps of that same treehouse, his voice shaking a little as he explained it. Ivy didn't cry in front of him, not right away. She just nodded slowly and said, "Okay, we'll write to each other. That's what we'll do. We'll write real letters, not just messages online, actual letters, because somehow that felt more meaningful, more real." And that's exactly what they did. For the first year, letters came almost every 2 weeks, filled with small details about daily life, funny stories about new classmates, complaints about difficult teachers, drawings Ivy would add in the margins because she always loved to sketch. Leo kept every single letter in an old shoebox under his bed, and Ivy did the same on her side, kept everything Leo sent her in a drawer beside her desk. But as the years went on, as it often happens, life got busier for both of them. New friends appeared, school became more demanding, and slowly, without either of them really deciding it on purpose, the letters became less frequent. Once every 2 weeks became once a month, then once every few months, and eventually, by the time they were both 19, the letters had almost completely stopped. Neither of them forgot the other, not really, but life simply pulled them in different directions, the way it often does, quietly, without asking permission. Leo went on to study engineering at a university in his new country, and Ivy stayed back home, studying to become a nurse, both of them building entirely separate lives, thousands of miles apart. Then, Almost 7 years after that difficult goodbye on the treehouse steps, something unexpected happened. Leo had to travel back to his home country for his cousin's wedding. And while he was there, purely out of curiosity, and maybe a little bit of nostalgia too, he decided to walk through his old neighborhood one afternoon. He wasn't expecting anything, honestly. He just wanted to see the old house, the old streets, maybe even the tree house if it was still standing. And there she was, Ivy, now 23, walking out of the very same house, carrying a small bag of groceries, completely unaware that Leo was standing just across the street. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Ivy dropped her grocery bag right there on the sidewalk, an apple rolling out and down the small hill of the street, and she practically ran across the road toward him. They stood there hugging for what felt like several minutes, both laughing and getting a little emotional at the same time, right there in the middle of the street, while a couple of curious neighbors watched from their windows, probably wondering what all the excitement was about. They spent the rest of that day together, sitting up in the old treehouse, which, believe it or not, was still standing, a little weaker, a little more worn by weather, but still there. They talked for hours, catching up on 7 years of life in a single afternoon, and by the end of the day, they both agreed on one simple thing: that real friendship, the genuine kind, doesn't actually disappear just because time and distance get in the way. It waits, quietly, patiently, ready to pick up right where it left off, sometimes exactly like nothing had ever changed at all. Now, let's talk through this story a little. Check what you understood. First question: how old were Leo and Ivy when they became friends? If you were listening closely, you'll remember they became friends at 6 years old, and they grew up on the same street. Second question: why did Leo have to move away? His father received a new job opportunity in another country, and the whole family had to relocate, which meant Leo had to say goodbye to Ivy when they were both 16. Third question: how did they decide to stay in touch? Instead of just messaging online, they chose to write actual letters to each other, real paper letters, because it felt more personal and meaningful to both of them. Fourth question: what happened to the letters over time? At first they wrote quite often, roughly every 2 weeks, but slowly, as their individual lives became busier, the letters became less and less frequent, until they almost stopped completely by the time they were 19. And fifth question: how did they meet again after all those years? Leo happened to visit his old neighborhood while back for his cousin's wedding, and he saw Ivy stepping out of her house completely by chance, and they reunited right there on the street. It's honestly one of my favorite kinds of stories, because it reminds us that real connections, real bonds between people, can survive even long silences, even years of distance, as long as the feeling underneath was genuine to begin with. All right, ready for story number 3? This one's a little different. It's about family, about a father and a son, and about learning what actually matters. Daniel worked long hours at a factory on the edge of town, 6 days a week most months, sometimes even 7 when the workload got heavy. He was a good man, honestly, hard-working, responsible, the kind of father who never missed paying a bill or providing what his family needed. But somewhere along the way, without really meaning to, he had also become a father who was rarely home in time for dinner. A father whose son, Max, had started to feel like a small, quiet stranger in his own house. Max was 10 years old, and more than almost anything else in the world, he wanted his father to help him fix his old bicycle. The chain kept slipping off, the brakes were squeaking badly, and he had asked Daniel about it, gently at first, then a little more directly, at least 4 or 5 times over the past 2 weeks. Every single time, Daniel would say the same thing. "Not today, buddy. I'm exhausted. Maybe this weekend." And every single weekend, something else always seemed to come up instead. Extra work, errands, exhaustion that simply refused to lift. One Saturday morning, Max decided he wasn't going to ask again. Instead, he quietly took his father's old toolbox from the garage and tried to fix the bicycle completely on his own. He didn't really know what he was doing. Not exactly. But he had watched enough videos, and he was determined, stubborn even, in that particular way 10-year-olds sometimes are. About 20 minutes in, while trying to loosen a stuck bolt, the wrench slipped, and it hit his hand hard enough to leave a nasty, deep scrape across his knuckles, along with quite a bit of blood. He didn't cry, not really. He was trying very hard to be brave about it. But he did walk into the kitchen holding his hand, looking for a bandage, and that's exactly when Daniel walked in from the other room and saw him standing there, blood on his hand, tears finally welling up despite his best effort to hold them back. Something inside Daniel just seemed to break open in that exact moment. He rushed over, cleaned the wound gently, wrapped it carefully, and then, quietly, he sat down right there on the kitchen floor next to his son and simply asked him, "Why didn't you wait for me, buddy?" And Max, still sniffling a little, looked up at him and said something that Daniel would honestly never forget for the rest of his life. He said, "Because you never have time, Dad, so I thought I'd just do it myself." There was no anger in his voice, no accusation, just plain, simple honesty, the kind that somehow hurts far more than shouting ever could. Daniel didn't say anything for a moment. He just held his son close. And later that same afternoon, despite being tired, despite having a dozen other things he probably should have been doing, he took the entire afternoon off from everything else and fixed that bicycle together with Max, step by step, teaching him how each part worked along the way. But, more importantly than fixing that one bicycle, something shifted permanently in Daniel after that day. He started leaving work slightly earlier whenever he genuinely could, made an actual effort to be home for dinner at least 4 nights a week instead of maybe 1, and made Saturday mornings, without exception, a time that belonged fully to Max. No excuses, no exhaustion allowed to get in the way. It wasn't a dramatic, sudden transformation. He was still the same hard-working man, still tired plenty of evenings. But he had learned, in the clearest way possible, that being present, actually present, mattered just as much as being responsible. Let's go through the comprehension questions for this one too. First, what was Max's problem with his bicycle? The chain kept slipping off, and the brakes were squeaking, and he wanted his father's help fixing it. Second question, why did Daniel keep saying no to helping him? He was simply exhausted from working long hours, 6 or even 7 days a week, and he kept postponing it, thinking he'd get to it eventually, maybe over the weekend. Third question, what happened when Max tried to fix the bike alone? He hurt his hand with a wrench while trying to loosen a bolt, leaving a fairly deep scrape and some bleeding, and that's when his father found him in the kitchen. Fourth question, What did Max say that affected his father so deeply? He simply told him, "Because you never have time, Dad, so I thought I'd just do it myself." A sentence that was honest rather than angry, but which clearly hit Daniel very hard emotionally. And fifth question, how did Daniel change after that day? He started coming home earlier when he could, made dinner together a priority several nights a week, and dedicated his Saturday mornings fully to spending time with Max. It's a gentle reminder, isn't it, that our children, or really anyone who loves us, doesn't always need grand gestures. Sometimes what they need most is simply our time, our attention, our presence. Now, before we move on to our fourth story, let's slow down for just a second and talk a little bit about vocabulary, because I noticed a few words in these stories that are genuinely useful for you to remember and reuse in your own conversations. For example, the word regular, as in a regular customer, meaning someone who comes back again and again. You could easily say, "I'm a regular at that restaurant," meaning you go there often. Another useful phrase was catching up, as in Leo and Ivy spent the afternoon catching up, which simply means telling each other what has happened since you last saw one another. You might say to a friend, "Let's meet for coffee and catch up soon," and that phrase alone will make you sound much more natural in everyday English conversation. All right, feeling good so far? Let's continue with our fourth story. This one is about starting over, about losing something and somehow finding something even better in its place. Grace had worked at the same marketing company for almost 6 years, steadily climbing from an entry-level assistant to a fairly respected position on the team. She wasn't necessarily passionate about marketing itself, if we're being completely honest, but the job paid her bills, gave her stability, and honestly, that felt like enough for a long time. Then, one difficult Monday morning, during a meeting she wasn't even initially invited to, she learned that the entire department was being restructured, and her position, along with several others, was simply being eliminated. She remembers sitting in her car afterward, in the parking lot, for almost 20 minutes, just staring blankly at the steering wheel, not entirely sure what to feel. Was it fear? Definitely, at least partly. Relief? Strangely, yes. A small, quiet part of her felt relieved too, though she couldn't quite explain why at that exact moment. For the first 2 weeks after losing her job, Grace mostly stayed home, sending out applications half-heartedly, watching entirely too much television, and generally feeling quite lost about what direction her life should take next. It was actually her grandmother, visiting for the weekend, who accidentally changed everything. Grace had always loved baking. Even as a child, she used to help her grandmother in the kitchen every single summer, making bread, cookies, pastries of all kinds, but she hadn't touched a mixing bowl seriously in years. Life had simply gotten too busy. That particular weekend, though, feeling restless and honestly a little desperate for something to do with her hands and her mind, she decided to bake a batch of cinnamon rolls, just for fun, just to remember what it felt like. Her grandmother tasted one, closed her eyes for a long moment, and said, quite simply, "Grace, honey, you need to sell these. People would pay good money for something this good." Grace laughed it off at first, thought it was just her grandmother being kind, the way grandmothers often are. But the idea somehow stuck in her mind over the following days. She started baking more, testing different recipes, different flavors, and eventually, nervously, She posted a few photos online, just to see what would happen. The response honestly surprised her. Friends started asking if they could order a dozen for a birthday party. Co-workers she barely spoke to reached out asking about wedding favors, and within about 2 months, she had saved up just enough money and gathered just enough courage to rent a small stand at the local weekend farmers market. Her first Saturday there, she was so nervous her hands were shaking as she arranged her cinnamon rolls and small loaves of banana bread on the table, terrified that nobody would even stop to look. But people did stop. Word had apparently spread a little already through friends and neighbors, and by early afternoon, she had completely sold out of everything she brought. She sat there afterward, at her now empty little stand, and honestly cried a little, right there in public, from pure happiness and disbelief. Losing that marketing job, something that had felt so devastating just a couple of months earlier, had actually pushed her towards something she genuinely loved, something that felt like it truly belonged to her. A year later, Grace had her own small bakery, nothing huge, just a cozy little shop on a corner street, but it was entirely hers, built from something that started as comfort baking during one of the hardest weeks of her life. She still tells people, when they ask about her career change, that sometimes the door closing on one thing is honestly the only way we ever find the courage to open a completely different one. Let's check your understanding now. First question: what happened to Grace at her marketing job? Her entire department was restructured, and her position was eliminated, meaning she suddenly lost her job. Second question: how did Grace feel immediately after losing her job? A mixture of feelings, really. Fear, but also a strange, unexpected sense of relief that she couldn't fully explain at first. Third question: what reminded Grace of her love for baking? Her grandmother's visit, during which Grace baked a batch of cinnamon rolls just for comfort, and her grandmother strongly encouraged her to consider selling them. Fourth question: how did Grace's small baking business begin? She started posting photos online, received requests from friends and co-workers, and eventually rented a small stand at her local farmer's market. And fifth question: what did Grace eventually build from this experience? Her own small bakery, a cozy corner shop that grew directly out of that difficult period when she lost her original job? This story really shows something beautiful, doesn't it? That difficult, painful moments in life, the ones that feel like endings, sometimes turn out to be quiet beginnings in disguise. Okay, one more story left, our fifth and final one for today. And this one is about family too, but specifically about siblings, about the kind of small conflicts that build up over years, and about how a single moment of crisis can wash all of that away. Ethan and his younger sister Rosa hadn't spoken properly in almost 8 months. It wasn't one single dramatic argument that caused the silence. Honestly, it was more like a slow buildup of smaller disagreements, misunderstandings about their late father's small property, disagreements about how to care for their aging mother, comments made in frustration that neither of them had ever properly apologized for. By the time 8 months had passed, they had simply settled into an uncomfortable, distant politeness whenever family gatherings forced them into the same room. Nothing more than that. Then, on an ordinary Thursday evening, Ethan received a phone call that made his stomach drop immediately. It was Rosa, her voice shaking uncontrollably, telling him that their mother had collapsed at home and was being rushed to the hospital. All the tension, all the months of careful distance between the siblings simply evaporated the second Ethan heard the fear in his sister's voice. He didn't think twice. He grabbed his car keys and drove straight to the hospital, breaking probably every speed limit along the way. He found Rosa sitting alone in the hospital waiting room, her hands trembling, her eyes red from crying, and without saying a single word about their past disagreements, he simply sat down right beside her and put his arm around her shoulders. She leaned into him immediately, the way she used to when they were children, and for the next 3 incredibly long hours, while doctors worked to stabilize their mother, the two of them sat together in near silence, occasionally speaking softly about childhood memories, about their mother's habit of humming while she cooked, about the way she always insisted on double-checking that every door was locked before bed. When the doctor finally emerged and told them their mother was stable, that she had suffered a minor stroke, but was expected to recover fully with proper care and physical therapy, both siblings broke down crying together, right there in the hallway, relief and exhaustion completely overwhelming them at the same time. And in that raw, emotional moment, Rosa finally turned to Ethan and said quietly, "I'm sorry for everything. I don't even remember exactly what we were fighting about anymore. And honestly, none of it matters now." Ethan nodded, holding her tightly, and admitted the exact same thing, that whatever had caused their 8 months of distance suddenly felt small, almost embarrassing, when compared to nearly losing their mother. In the weeks that followed, as their mother slowly recovered at home, Ethan and Rosa found themselves working together constantly, coordinating her medication schedules, taking turns driving her to physical therapy appointments, and somewhere within all of that shared responsibility, their old closeness, the bond they had as children, quietly returned, stronger, in many ways, than it had ever been before. Their mother, once she was well enough to notice, would often smile and say that in some strange way, her health scare had actually given her something wonderful. Her 2 children talking to each other again, laughing together again, exactly the way she had always wished they would. Let's check our understanding of this final story. First question, why hadn't Ethan and Rosa been speaking? It wasn't one big fight, but rather a slow buildup of smaller disagreements, mostly related to their father's property and how to care for their mother. Second question, what event brought them back together? Their mother collapsed at home and was rushed to the hospital, and the fear of that moment immediately erased the distance between the siblings. Third question, how did they behave with each other at the hospital? They sat together quietly, Ethan comforting Rosa with his arm around her, talking softly about happy childhood memories while waiting for news. Fourth question, what did the doctor say about their mother's condition? That she had suffered a minor stroke but was stable and was expected to fully recover with proper care and physical therapy. And fifth question, how did the siblings' relationship change after this experience? They worked together taking care of their mother, and through that shared responsibility, their old closeness as children gradually returned, becoming even stronger than before. All right, let's keep going, because I've actually got 2 more stories saved for you today, and honestly, these last 2 might be my favorites. So stay with me a little longer. Claire had been teaching third grade for almost 9 years, and if you asked her, she'd tell you she genuinely loved her job. Even on the chaotic days, the days when someone spilled paint across the classroom floor, or when the fire alarm went off right in the middle of a math lesson for absolutely no reason at all. But there was one particular student that year, a quiet boy named Aiden, who worried her more than she liked to admit. Aiden used to be one of her brightest students, always raising his hand first, always finishing his work early and asking for more. But somewhere around the middle of the school year, something changed. He started arriving late, sometimes without breakfast, his clothes occasionally looking a little too small or slightly worn, and his once excellent homework had become messy, incomplete, or missing entirely. Claire noticed, of course. Teachers usually notice these things, but for weeks she wasn't quite sure how to approach it without embarrassing him in front of his classmates. One afternoon, while the other children were out at recess, she asked Aiden gently to stay behind for just a minute. Told him she wasn't upset. She simply wanted to check in and see how he was doing lately. At first, he just shrugged and stared at his shoes, insisting everything was fine, the way children often do when they're trying very hard to protect something painful. But Claire waited patiently, said nothing more, just sat quietly beside him, and eventually his shoulders dropped, and the words came out slowly, hesitantly. His father had lost his job almost 2 months earlier, and things at home had become difficult. Really difficult. There were nights, he admitted quietly, when dinner was just crackers, or sometimes nothing at all, and his parents had been arguing constantly about money, loud enough that he could hear it clearly through his bedroom wall. He said he had been staying up late worrying, which was exactly why he kept arriving at school so tired and unfocused. Claire felt her heart tighten listening to him, but she kept her voice calm and steady, told him thank you for trusting her with something so difficult, and promised him quietly that they would figure something out together. That same day, she spoke with the school counselor, and within a week, Aiden's family had been connected with a local food assistance program, along with some additional support resources his parents hadn't even known were available to them. But Claire didn't stop there. Quietly, without ever making it obvious to the rest of the class, she started keeping a small box of snacks in her desk drawer, and she made sure Aiden, along with a couple of other students she suspected might also be struggling, always had something to eat if they needed it. No questions asked, no attention drawn. She also began staying 15 minutes later after school twice a week, offering a little extra homework help to anyone who wanted to stay, which allowed Aiden to catch up without feeling singled out in front of his classmates. Slowly, over the following months, Aiden's father found a new job. Things at home began to stabilize, and Aiden himself gradually returned to being the bright, curious boy Claire remembered from the beginning of the year. Near the end of the school year, his mother came to Claire during a parent meeting, and with tears in her eyes, thanked her, not just for the schoolwork help, but for noticing, for caring enough to ask a simple question on an ordinary afternoon when it would have been so much easier to look away. Claire always says that teaching, real teaching, isn't only about lessons and grades. It's about paying attention to the whole child standing in front of you, because sometimes a distracted, tired student isn't lazy at all. Sometimes they're simply carrying something heavy that has nothing to do with school whatsoever. Let's go through the questions for this story as well. First question, what changed about Aiden partway through the school year? He began arriving late, sometimes without breakfast, and his homework, once excellent, became messy or missing altogether. Second question, why was Aiden struggling at home? His father had lost his job, money was tight, and his parents had been arguing frequently, which kept Aiden up late worrying at night. Third question, how did Claire find out what was happening? She gently asked him to stay behind after class one afternoon. And after some patient silence, Aiden eventually opened up and explained the situation at home. Fourth question, what did Claire do to help? She connected his family with a food assistance program through the school counselor, kept snacks available in her classroom discreetly, and offered extra homework help after school twice a week. And fifth question, how did the story end? Aiden's father eventually found a new job. Life at home stabilized, and Aiden slowly returned to being the curious, engaged student he had been before, while his mother thanked Claire deeply for noticing and caring. Okay, one final story for today. I promise, this is the last one. And it's a little different from the others. This one takes place almost entirely during a single evening, between two complete strangers. Oliver had never really enjoyed traveling by train. If he was being honest, he found it slow and a little boring compared to flying. But a last-minute work meeting had left him with no other reasonable option that particular evening. The train was already running about 40 minutes late when he boarded, and by the time it left the station, dark storm clouds had rolled in overhead, promising an unpleasant journey ahead. He found a seat near the window, put in his earphones, fully intending to ignore the world for the next few hours, when a woman, probably in her early 30s, sat down across from him, slightly out of breath, clearly having rushed to catch the train just in time. She introduced herself simply as Hannah, apologizing immediately for practically falling into the seat, and despite Oliver's initial plan to stay quiet and keep to himself, something about her friendly, slightly nervous energy made him smile and remove one earphone instead. They exchanged a few polite words at first, simple small talk about the terrible weather and the delayed train. But then, about 20 minutes in, the storm outside grew dramatically worse, thunder cracking loudly enough to make several passengers jump, and the train suddenly slowed down completely, eventually stopping entirely somewhere between stations. An announcement crackled over the speakers, informing everyone that a fallen tree was blocking the tracks ahead, and that they should expect a significant delay while crews worked to clear it. Groans and sighs spread through the train car. Phones came out immediately as people started rearranging plans, calling family members, canceling dinner reservations. Hannah sighed heavily and admitted to Oliver that she was actually supposed to be at the hospital that very night. Her sister was in labor with her first child, and Hannah had promised she would be there for the birth, no matter what. Oliver could see the genuine worry building on her face as the minutes ticked by with no updates from the train staff. Instead of simply offering polite sympathy and going back to his music, Oliver found himself doing something a little unusual for him. He offered to help her figure out an alternative plan. Using his phone, he searched for nearby transportation options, discovered there was actually a taxi service that operated in the small town where the train had stopped, roughly a 15-minute walk from their current location if they left the train and crossed through a nearby field. It felt like a slightly ridiculous plan, walking through a thunderstorm in the middle of nowhere. But Hannah's determination was contagious. And honestly, Oliver found himself caught up in it too. They asked a train conductor for permission, grabbed Oliver's spare umbrella from his bag, and set off together through the rain, laughing nervously at the absurdity of the entire situation. Two strangers hiking through a stormy field just hours after meeting. They eventually reached the small town, thoroughly soaked despite the umbrella, found the taxi service, and Hannah practically threw herself into gratitude, offering to pay for Oliver's fare as well since he had ended up leaving the train alongside her. He agreed to share the taxi at least part way, since his own destination wasn't too far off course, and during that ride, they talked more openly than two strangers typically would, about family, about unexpected moments in life, about how sometimes the most memorable nights come from plans falling apart entirely rather than going smoothly. When they finally parted ways outside the hospital, Hannah hugged him tightly, thanked him again, and exchanged numbers, promising to let him know how everything turned out. Later that night, Oliver received a message from her, a photo of her newborn nephew, along with a simple message that read, "He's here, healthy and perfect, and I made it just in time. Thank you for tonight. I genuinely don't think I would have made it without your help." Oliver sat there smiling at his phone for a long moment, thinking about how strange life could be sometimes, how a delayed train and a fallen tree had somehow led to him playing a small but meaningful part in someone else's most important night. Let's review the comprehension questions for this final story too. First question: why was Oliver traveling by train that evening? A last-minute work meeting left him without a better travel option, even though he generally preferred flying over taking the train. Second question: what caused the train to stop completely? A fallen tree was blocking the tracks ahead during a heavy thunderstorm, forcing the train to halt indefinitely between stations. Third question: why was Hannah so worried during the delay? Her sister was in labor with her first child, and Hannah had promised to be there at the hospital for the birth, no matter what happened. Fourth question: what plan did Oliver help Hannah come up with? He found a nearby taxi service in a small town roughly a 15-minute walk away, and they left the train together, walking through the storm to reach it. And fifth question: how did the story end? Hannah made it to the hospital in time for her nephew's birth, and later sent Oliver a photo, along with a heartfelt thank you message, grateful that a stranger's kindness had helped her get there when it truly mattered. So there we have it, 7 short stories in total today. A lonely old man and a caring young barista, 2 childhood friends separated by an ocean, a busy father learning what truly matters, a woman finding unexpected purpose after losing her job, 2 siblings brought back together by fear and love, a teacher who noticed a struggling student, and 2 strangers who helped each other through an unexpected storm. 7 completely different situations, but if you noticed, they all share something quite similar underneath, don't they? They're all about connection, about people needing each other, noticing each other, showing up for each other, even in small, quiet ways. Now, here's something I really want you to try, and I promise it'll help your English more than you might expect. Go back and pick just one of these 5 stories, whichever one affected you the most emotionally, and try retelling it out loud, in your own words, in English, even if it's just a short summary, even if you make small mistakes along the way. That's completely fine. Mistakes are simply part of learning. Speaking a story back in your own words forces your brain to actively use new vocabulary and sentence structures rather than just passively recognizing them. And that active practice is honestly where the real progress happens. And if you're feeling a little more confident, try answering this question out loud too, in English. Which of these 5 stories reminded you most of something in your own life, and why? Maybe Daniel and Max's story reminded you of your own relationship with your father. Or maybe Grace's story reminded you of a time you also had to start over after losing something important. Speak your answer out loud, even if you're completely alone in your room right now. Because practicing out loud, even without another person listening, genuinely strengthens your speaking fluency over time. Before we wrap up completely, I want to remind you, gently, that improving your English listening skills isn't really about understanding 100% of every single word you hear, not even close. It's about training your brain to catch the overall meaning, the emotion, the general flow of natural spoken English, and that skill builds slowly, patiently, story by story, episode by episode. If you understood most of what we covered today, that's genuinely wonderful progress. And if there were parts that felt a little difficult, that's completely okay too. You can always come back and listen again, maybe even a second or third time. And I promise you'll notice you understand more each time you do. If today's episode helped you even a little bit, I would truly appreciate it. If you hit that subscribe button right now, it genuinely helps this channel grow, and it helps me keep creating free content like this for learners just like you all around the world. Drop a comment below and tell me which of the 5 stories you liked the most. I read every single comment, and I love hearing from you. It honestly makes my day. And if you know a friend, a classmate, anyone at all who's also working on improving their English, please consider sharing this video with them. Learning together, honestly, tends to be so much more motivating than learning entirely alone. Thank you so much for spending this time with me today. I know your time is valuable, and I never take it for granted that you chose to spend part of your day here on English in Fluency. Keep practicing, keep listening, keep speaking out loud even when it feels a little uncomfortable at first, because that discomfort, believe me, is exactly where real growth happens. This is Alex, signing off for today, and I'll see you in the very next episode. Take care of yourselves, and happy learning.